The year is 1370. To the west, the League of the Storm Cross consolidates unprecedented power and control over the European continent. To the south, the Turco-Persian Shia Muslims of Parthia are in the midst of hollowing out their own empire through a devastating civil war. And to the east, the successor states of the Mongols are trying to claw their way back to relevance. Meanwhile, Royal Scythia has been in a world of its own yet again. It has been solely focused on a singular campaign that will mark them as glorious and admirable people beyond what they already boast. Indeed, people of the world, behold what Royal Scythia has claimed of the Wild East in just the last 12 years. Scythia's conquest of the Siberian East has been a challenge both uniquely suited to them and also uniquely challenging in ways not initially expected. As they took land and settled it, they brought in people who were willing to be sedentary in order to claim the land. This included many Scythians of minor clans who had once dwelled in cities, but also some Slavs and even about 5 or 6 intrepid Greek explorers and Armenian outlaws seeking a new start on the other side of the world, to a place where their past could not reach them. In any case, the traditional Scythian modes of settlement wouldn't quite work in the harsh taiga the same way it did on the steppe. The ground was harder and gave less grass for horses, who often froze to death without the proper furs, and on the same hand was rather tough to work for the purposes of agriculture. Scythian settlers in the far northeast had to abandon their traditional methods in order to survive. While the warriors kept their horses bundled warm and pressed east in combat, dwelling in yurts along the way, the swell of Scythian settlers that followed them brought goats and cows and chickens, building cabins out of heavy timbers to live in, and constructing special stables and pens which were partially underground and which benefited from sharing the heat generated by the cabin's constantly burning fire in the hearth. These people ate mainly animal products as a result, with the foraging of berries and forest mushrooms and wild tubers as a way to supplement their eggs and milk, with the hunting of wild game rounding out the diet with fatty meat from elk and sometimes fish or even seal if they lived close enough to the sea. Their main modes of transportation became sleds pulled by hardy horses bred for the cold, sometimes even pulled by packs of dogs in rare cases. They also innovated snowshoes and skis with which to navigate areas of thick, typically innavigable snowfall. With time, these intrepid settlers and their families would band together to form towns and communities in desirable areas. Indeed, the lives of these Scythians were so distinct and insular that, eventually, cultural and lingual drift would begin to occur. These early settlers were the ancestors of those people who would one day be called the Pidrazira, meaning Sons of the Ice. So, this is the story of the settlers, but what of the mighty men whose job it was to conquer the untamed wilds? As they charged across the northern steppe and conquered the taiga, the local peoples barely stood a chance. The scattered tribal cousins of the Mongols fought admirably, but their numbers were too small and their ways too primitive to effectively resist the Scythian advance. Many of them fled into the Tobol Khanate, seeking safety among the Blue Horde, though they found themselves there as pariahs, being descendants of those men who did not join in the creation of the great empire that swallowed Asia. This would be a source of ethnic tension for generations to come. Meanwhile, many of the tribes to the deep north were people the Scythians had never seen before. Dark, leathery skin, black eyes, and affable speech with a set of simple desires: to be able to trod the snow flat, build a little hut, light a little fire, and eat a little seal meat or the boiled roots of a winter plant. The majority of these people simply moved further east, not necessarily attached to where they called their home. But some tribes realized that this continent did not go on forever, and that, on a long enough timescale, the Scythians would chase them straight into the sea. So, some peoples found themselves in the mood to stay and fight. In 1370, while the Scythians were still in the middle of their eastern expansion, there was a tribal leader who had risen up and united several Siberian peoples. He was a man from the east, who had headed west with an entourage of his village's finest warriors, hoping to rally the other tribes and halt the Scythian advance. Indeed, given these people spoke a myriad of languages, each darkly and ambiguously intelligible across populations, it was all the more impressive that he got 5 tribes to band together, and it was a question of how long they'd be able to last. The name of this tribal war chief was Atahacci, meaning he who eats horses, and the name of his tribal alliance was the Beskar-Ishishilier, meaning 5 masters of the snow. They burst onto the scene in 1368 and immediately became boogeymen among Scythian settlers. Their major opening strategy as a force of many thousands was to focus on raiding the settler families that had become the symbols of Scythian settlement and domination of the land. They would burn down cabins with whole families inside, and other times they would take hostages and mutilate them, leaving them in places where other Scythians were sure to find them. Their most common raiding strategy, however, was to overwhelm a family of 5 or 6 with many dozens of men, and take everything of any worth, then flee, leaving them to die of hunger or exposure. One of the most egregious examples was when warriors of the Beskar raided a settlement complex consisting of 6 families, burned everything they had built to crackling cinders, and skinned those left alive using the shells of mussels, stripping men, women, and even children of their skin as they tossed living pieces into the fires that were once the homes they built with their own 2 hands. This caused Scythia to stop its eastward expansion, for a time, in order to deal with Atahacci and the abominations of his men, beginning the short-lived yet bloody conflict known as Atahacci's War. The Jasapavan of the furthest east, a man named Saulius Agorid, used his authority to raise an army and launch a campaign of extermination against the native Siberian peoples, regardless if they could be identified as loyal subjects of Atahacci or not. To Saulius, any number of native deaths were worth it if their blood saved a single Scythian life. His men despoiled villages across the land, and Saulius became renowned for his death totems, where he stacked dozens of victims impaled horizontally on a great stake, a typically thin yet hardy tree that could be sharpened, cleared of branches, and loaded with its grisly charge before being set in the ground upright again. Some victims would survive for some time, usually those closest to the top and not crushed by the weight of 30, 40, or 50 corpses. It was said that their moans could be heard for miles on a quiet day. Things came to a head in the dead of winter, December of 1370. This day marked the Battle of Red Snow. Saulius, following the tracks of villagers he was intending to erect on a death totem, did not realize that him and his men had fallen for carefully placed bait. Atahacci and his men came pouring down either side of a low valley, raining arrows down into the Scythian army and savaging them with clubs and daggers. The initial Scythian casualties were immense, and it seemed like Atahacci would have his fill of horse meat that day. However, as their numbers dwindled, the resolve of the blood-soaked Scythians increased, and the men decided to focus all their energies on fighting up towards one side of the valley to break encirclement. This gambit worked, and having captured the left side of the high ridge, they all drew their pistols at once and began to fire into the crowd below. This broke the tribals, who began to flee, but not before many dead were left in their wake. One such dead was Atahacci himself, who was lying mangled in the branches of a shrub, with 6 holes in his body and 2 in his head, each yawning wound the size of a gold coin. With Atahacci dead, the short-lived Beskar-Ishishilier fell apart, and many of these men, too, fled east. In any case, the story of Atahacci would continue to haunt the Siberian wastes as a ghost story among Scythian settlers, as he would morph into a strange horse-eating and man-slaying monster of myth with the head of an elk and long claws made of mussel shells, becoming known as the Atahacci. Though he lived but a short time, the savage terror he inflicted would live on, inspiring his own people to violence and inspiring the Scythians to fight ever harder for this wild, mysterious land.